Hello again and welcome back. It's Jared Case, curator of film exhibitions at the Dryden Theater and the George Eastman Museum, and I've got another streaming recommendation for you. So on Sundays, we've been using our recommendations to highlight previous honorees of the George Eastman Award. And it's been going on since the 1950s, almost 70 years that we've been giving out this award. But I've been sort of working our way back from the most recent, Julia Roberts last year, into the past. And we're back to the year 1999. And the recipient that year was none other than Meryl Streep. So just a little over 20 years ago, Meryl Streep was on the stage at the Dryden Theater receiving her award. And if you want to put this in context of her filmography, it was around the time that she was getting an Oscar nomination for Music of the Heart. And at that point in time, she was getting what amounts to a Lifetime Achievement Award. And just imagine all of the great performances she's given us since then. So it was a good choice by us back then, I think. I'm going to go back for our recommendation today to another Oscar nomination that she had 17 years earlier in a film called The French Lieutenant's Woman. Now, this is not just a Meryl Streep recommendation, but I also like to bring attention to these films, particularly the dramas from the early 80s, because at the sort of the birth of the blockbuster, that first decade there, I think that these films, there's a lot of good films that are being made at that point in time, and they're just overlooked or underestimated because of it. I think there is definitely a shift towards the last half of the decade where they get a little bit more bombastic, these Oscar-type films, the dramas that we're supposed to recognize, whether it's Rain Man or Driving Miss Daisy. They're a little bit different, but the ones in the early 80s are still more grounded, much like the dramas that we got in the 70s, although they were still working within the studio system. And The French Lieutenant's Woman is one of them. It's a fascinating adaptation of a 1969 novel by John Fowles, which in and of itself was already sort of postmodern in the way that it approached its story. So it's the story of a man, played by Jeremy Irons in the film, who is engaged to be married to a young woman, and he's, possibly going to get into business with her father. There's certainly the aspect of money that interests him, but he's fine with this relationship, and he meets this woman on a pier, the French lieutenant's woman, as it were, played by Meryl Streep, of course. And this is a woman who has been pining for a French sailor who may or may not ever return. And he becomes fascinated by her, not just in sort of an attraction kind of way, but he longs to sort of become her savior. And so he becomes interested in her and helping her. And of course, a romance develops, and in true Victorian fashion, it becomes very, very complicated. So this, the novel itself had 3 endings. So not only was it playing with the conventions of the Victorian romance, but it also said that, not everything ends the same way. It gives 3 possible endings, one of which is supposedly a fantasy or a dream, and then there's a happy ending, and it's a slightly sadder ending. Harold Pinter, the playwright, wrote the screenplay for the adaptation of the book to the film. And he added another layer, another meta layer. So the film, obviously, or the book is being adapted into a film, but we're also watching that film be produced. So Jeremy Irons and Meryl Streep are both playing each of the parts, the central romance within the book being adapted into a film, and the actors who are playing those roles. And the film sort of gets to have its cake and eat it too, or eat its cake and have it too. It's the other way around. And it has 2 endings. Obviously, both relationships have to end by the time the film ends, but they end in different ways, and I'm not going to tell you which one is which. But it adds that extra layer of storytelling and how we become the characters, particularly in drama, and how we become the characters and how we live through the characters and how that affects our lives. A fascinating portrait, and it's definitely one of those overlooked films from the early 80s. It also happens to star Meryl Streep, who is our George Eastman Award recipient highlight for this week. It's streaming on the Criterion channel, so please go ahead and check that out, and then come on back for another recommendation. We'll be here.